Honourable Senators, I rise to speak to Bill C-15, an act respecting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, commonly known as UNDRIP. Thank you to Senator Laboucan-Benson for ably sponsoring the bill and to members of the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples for their diligent work. I very strongly support this measure, both the legislation itself and the spirit of it. I felt the same way in 2018 when I spoke on the last, but far from the first, UNDRIP attempt, then Bill C-262, as part of my inaugural speech in this chamber. Actually, it wasn't this chamber, it was the old chamber, but it was the chamber. It is my hope, and the hope of many others, that this will be the final round of speeches on implementing UNDRIP. Bringing Canada's domestic laws into line with the Declaration is long overdue, colleagues. UNDRIP was adopted by the United Nations in 2007 by 144 member states. Canada voted against it at the time, but endorsed it, but did not sign in 2010, and then adopted it in 2016. Only now, after introduction in the House of Commons in December 2020, following years of promises by the government and years of private members' bills, is Parliament dealing with implementation as a matter of government business. Getting this done is a vital step in the ever-evolving journey of reconciliation. After a year marked not just by a once-in-a-century global health crisis, but also by a generational reckoning with systemic racism and discrimination, it is a step we must take now. To anyone questioning why this is so important, I wish to offer just a few reasons. In 2021, we were still debating constitutionally enshrined Supreme Court-affirmed treaty rights that the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples have held for 260 years to fish, hunt, and gather to provide for their families. I refer, of course, to the now adopted motion of Senator Francis and Senator Christmas on the dispute in Nova Scotia between Indigenous and non-Indigenous commercial lobster fishers. While 107 long-term drinking water advisories have been lifted since November of 2015, as of May 21st, there are 52 still in effect in 33 First Nations communities across Canada. There's the huge overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in Canada's criminal justice system compared to non-Indigenous peoples. In fact, while the proportion of non-Indigenous peoples in Canada's jails has been decreasing over the past decade, the rate of incarcerated Indigenous peoples has been increasing for much longer. Indigenous peoples compose only 5% of Canada's population, but represent more than 30% of inmates in federal prisons. Among incarcerated women, 42% are Indigenous. Reaching this 30% threshold led the Correctional Investigator of Canada in a statement in January 2020 to refer to the deepening indigenization of Canada's correctional system. Indigenous women and girls have been so disproportionately victimized by violence that we needed the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, the final report of which called for full implementation of and compliance with UNDRIP. The 43rd call to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired of course by our former colleague Murray Sinclair, also urged all levels of government in Canada to fully adopt and implement the Declaration. Finally, the remains of 215 innocent children were recently found in unmarked graves on the site of what was once the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. The institution closed in 1978. That's far from ancient history, colleagues. We know there are more such graves across Canada, and the government must do much more to fund and support searches of former school sites as the TRC called for. That we know there are more grim discoveries to come makes it even harder to fathom how many families suffered not just the theft of their children, but also their chance to bury them and say goodbye in a dignified way, following their own traditions and customs. It goes without saying that the tragic legacy of generational pain and trauma caused by colonialism, and especially the residential school system, continues to cast a long shadow. Reconciliation, required because of historical mistreatment and abuse, has shaped public policy discourse in Canada in recent years. There has been progress, there has been regression, there has been maintenance of the status quo. Bill C-15 provides a golden shot at progress, the legislative framework to implement UNDRIP in Canada and to advance reconciliation. We cannot change the wrongs of the past, but we can fix today's injustices and work toward a better future built on a strong nation-to-nation relationship. That is the opportunity offered by Bill C-15, colleagues. The articles contained in the Declaration affirm a principled framework for justice, reconciliation, healing, and peace. There is little, if any, disagreement on that. La principale objection à la législation.
The main objection to this bill in the past and today has revolved around the issue of free, prior, and informed consent. Specifically, this term has led to concerns that it amounts to Indigenous peoples having the power to veto actions and projects that would impact their communities, lands, and/or treaty rights. How this consent requirement would work when it comes to resource development and economic projects is a point of contention for opponents because the term is not defined in C-15. C-15, and consent specifically, has been charged with being anti-development because of the perception that free, prior, and informed consent provides Indigenous peoples with veto power to stop and/or block projects with which they do not agree. If that's the case, critics say, and especially without a clear definition, Canada will lose economic opportunities because resource and energy companies will not want to risk their projects being delayed by required consultations or even blocked down the line, especially if the project is controversial.
Though concerns about consent being a veto are unfounded. On May 7th, in his appearance before the Senate's Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, the sponsor of C-15, Minister of Justice David Lametti, was clear. He said, "Free, prior, and informed consent is not a veto over government decision-making. FPIC does not remove or replace government decision-making authority, but it sets into place a process which will ensure meaningful participation." The point of free, prior, and informed consent, far from being anti-development, is meant to ensure that the long-held rights of Indigenous peoples are respected. Testifying before the House of Commons Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs on April 13th, Assembly First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde summed up not just the need for, but indeed the benefit of free, prior, and informed consent. He said, "To me, that's what this bill speaks to. Joint decision-making, getting involved sooner rather than later so you avoid blockades and you avoid legal battles." Meaningful engagement with Indigenous communities early on is hugely important because it provides stability in that all sides know what to expect and how they will be included right from the start. Further, it avoids, as Chief Bellegarde and others have pointed out, long and costly court battles and blockades, all of which are damaging on multiple levels. Nothing, no power, no authority is being taken away from the government, nor from anyone else. Free, prior, and informed consent is about empowering Indigenous peoples to be able to meaningfully exercise their treaty rights and those enshrined in the Constitution. It is about dismantling the long-standing colonial approach to Canada's dealings with Indigenous communities whereby decisions that impact them are made without them. This is fundamental, colleagues. We cannot continue the journey of reconciliation, nor can Canada speak credibly about the importance it places on the nation-to-nation relationship if we keep getting hung up on this misguided fear that the right to free, prior, and informed consent equates to veto power. But it is not enough to simply accept what it is not. We must also fully accept and recognize that Indigenous peoples have long held and hard-won rights to have a meaningful say over what happens on their lands and in their communities. This brings me back to my earlier point about what we are still discussing in 2021 and how far we have left to go.
The last point I wish to make is about two of the major strengths of Bill C-15. In addition to requiring that Canada's domestic laws be brought into line with the Declaration, C-15 also states that the Minister must, in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples and with other federal ministers, prepare and implement an action plan to achieve the objectives of the Declaration. This action plan must be completed no later than 2 years after royal assent and must include measures to address and combat a wide range of issues that negatively impact Indigenous peoples. It must include ways to monitor the plan's implementation, must be tabled in Parliament, and must be made public. Further, the Minister will be required, after consultation and in cooperation with Indigenous peoples, to report annually to Parliament on the progress of implementing the Declaration and the Action Plan. Colleagues, this is how real change happens, with monitoring and measuring progress, and with, above all, accountability.
Refer to the Declaration as an aspirational document. Many of the concerns from back then are ones we've heard throughout the various iterations of UNDRIP's Rocky Road in our Parliament. It is no longer good enough to simply aspire to implementing the Declaration in Canada, and we cannot keep coming up with excuses. Not in 2021, and not after the many lessons learned over the past year and even more recently. Canada will never live up to its promise and potential without taking significant strides on that ever-evolving journey of reconciliation. We will not get there if we do not get this done. I urge all honourable senators to vote in favour of C-15. Thank you.